And welcome to the Kennedy School. This forum discussion this afternoon is the grand finale of sorts of a day-long symposium entitled Towards a New Environmental Order, the UN Tackles Environment and Development. This morning there was an interesting panel discussion about the role of institutions, an afternoon panel discussion about resource and technology transfer, and we're very excited about the panel we have set up for this afternoon. My name is Chris Wolz. I'm representing the students and others on the organizing committee for this event. This has been a symposium organized primarily by students and for students. All the rest of you are quite welcome. Please stay where you are. Our rationale or our motivation for organizing this symposium started a good year ago and strengthened this past fall. We're very interested in sponsoring a public event and discussing the issues of environment and development, the interplay, the tension between them throughout the world, especially in developing countries. And the UNCED conference, Brazil 92, which will be the focus this afternoon, became a natural focal point for our plans. The kinds of issues that interested us and motivated us to organize this were the issues of power balance between developed and developing countries, north-south balance, whether or not a new environmental order through the UNCED process or any other UN institution will, in fact, empower developing countries, give them a new opportunity to raise issues on the international agenda, or if it isn't a form of environmental colonialism. These are the types of questions that motivated us to sponsor this event, and it's an exciting one. Again, the organizers have been the Energy and Environment Student Interest Group, the International Development Interest Group of the Kennedy School, along with the International Environmental Negotiations Network at MIT and the Coolidge Center for Environmental Leadership. We'd like to thank our sponsors, financial sponsors, who have made this all possible: the Harvard Institute for International Development, Center for Science and International Affairs of the Kennedy School, the Pacific Basin Research Center, and Conservation International. We're excited this afternoon to have as moderator Associate Professor Shanta Devarajan. He's a professor of public policy, works and teaches and does research extensively in international development. Professor?
Thank you very much, Chris. And I have an enviable task today of introducing our distinguished panel of speakers. But before I start, I want to make an announcement about the next event after this one that's going to take place at the forum. The KSSG, the Kennedy School Student Government, would like to remind everyone that tonight is International Night. International Night features food from around the world, followed by a program of performances put on by international students here at the Kennedy School. And tickets for International Night, which begins at 7 p.m. with the food, will be on sale immediately after this forum event. The three speakers at the forum today represent, in many ways, three different perspectives on the problem of environment and development, and they will speak in turn. I think they'd like me to emphasize that none of them is speaking as a representative of his or her government, but rather as individuals who are deeply committed to the issue of environment and development, and in particular the UN Conference on Environment and Development. Our first speaker is Fabio Feldman, a native of Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is where the conference will be held. Fabio was trained as a lawyer, and his professional work has mainly been in the areas of human rights, Indian rights, and environmental law. He's the founder of the Brazilian NGO called Mata Atlântica, and has served as president of several environmental and Indian rights NGOs. In 1986, Mr. Feldman was elected to the Brazilian National House of Representatives and has been known in many circles as Brazil's first unabashed green congressman. He was re-elected in 1990 and continues to serve as congressman as the real focal point for action as well as concern about environmental, Indian, and human rights issues in Brazil. And internationally, he is known as an alternative voice from Brazil. He has a close working relationship with many international environmental organizations. He's on the board of Conservation International. And Fabio Feldman received the UNEP Global 500 Prize, which is special recognition given every 5 years for 500 global environmental activists. So I'm pleased to introduce Fabio Feldman.
It's a real honor for me to come here to discuss the United Nations conference that will take place in Brazil. I have more doubts than answers, because we don't have much time to prepare ourselves to this conference, but we have time. And what we have seen, in fact, is the feeling. We have a feeling in Brazil, and I can tell you because just a few days before coming here, we had a meeting in Brazil with some Latin American NGOs in order to discuss our agenda. What can be the most important issues to be discussed in the United Nations conference? Then we see how complex it is to design an agenda and what we expect from this conference. We have a feeling that, and I want to emphasize it to Mr. Strong, that United Nations conference in Brazil can be transformed in an environmental circus when you have the most important leaders of the world, very, very important NGOs there in the parallel event. Everything could be done before, and we have all media there, and we will sign some important conventions, but we will not be able to discuss the subject of this conference, that is the connection between environment and development. In my opinion, it's not so difficult to discuss some issues like biodiversity, pollution, global warming, but if you don't discuss these issues and we try to make the connections in order to establish a new order, we will fail in this conference, as I think it happened in 72. 72 was really very important because until the Stockholm conference, it was very difficult to talk about environmental issues. But if you see what happened from 72 to 90 or 88, we can see that there is a little difference in the world. And we can prove, I can prove what I'm saying here, if you read the Brundtland Report Commission. It's a real, very good document. It proves that we must save the planet. But if you see the Brundtland Report and you see what was done, the result, the balance, is very negative balance. But, of course, it's very, very difficult to make the connections between environment and development, as it's very, very difficult to have a clear conception of sustainable development. We discussed all day about some ideas, technology transfer and some other ideas, but we have an intuition about what can be a sustainable development, but we have no idea how to implement it. And I am afraid that the United Nations conference in Brazil, we cannot start a new era, because we can have a new conception of sustainable development if we can change the international economic order. It's very easy to go to Brazil and to discuss or to sign a biodiversity convention, but we will never save the biodiversity in Brazil or any place if you cannot design a new society and we can establish new relations between developed and underdeveloped countries. It's very easy to come to the United States, to Europe and other countries, and come here and say the problem is the external debt. Okay, we have discussed external debt in this conference, because external debt can be one of the issues where we cannot have a compromise. And I think it's important, maybe for us here, to discuss, to establish a methodology when you can separate in which issues we can have a compromise, which issues can be impossible or very difficult to make a compromise. Why? Because in the issues that it will be very difficult to make a compromise are the crucial issues. Suppose that it's unbelievable, it's a dream, that all the most important developed countries go to Brazil and say, okay, you don't have to pay the external debt. It's a real solution? No, because after 10 years, you have again a great external debt because we don't change the terms of trade. Then what I am proposing here for students of the most important, most well-known university of the world, Harvard, the representatives of very important NGOs, is to see if we can face the challenge to design a strategic plan in order to transform the United Nations Conference in a very important real event. And maybe the parallel event can be the most important, because I have doubts in such a way. But I know that the most important international conventions are being discussed here in the United States, other places, in Brazil. But it will be very difficult to discuss other issues that I think are much more important, the Biodiversity Convention, Global Warming Convention, because if you are not able to discuss and to design the strategic plan, we fail, as I think many people fail in the 72 conference. Today, this morning, I told you, and I have to repeat, that I think we must have some changes, not only in UNEP, but UNDP, United Nations, in order to have new conceptions of sovereignty. And when we are discussing in this evening, and the representative of the World Bank gave us an example about what happened with a loan that had been discussed with the Brazilian government and the World Bank concerning the energetic plan project. It's a good example. I am against nuclear plants, everybody knows. And I am against the energetic Brazilian plan because they intend to build 300 hydroelectrics. It's really a nightmare. But why the World Bank didn't give the money? Because Brazil did not sign the TNP, Treaty of Non-Proliferation. And why Brazil? And why I disagree with this, with the fact why I think Brazil were not supposed to sign this treaty, because it maintains the actual nuclear status quo. Brazil is submitted, and other countries, to international inspections, but it doesn't happen the same procedure to United States or other countries. I think the United Nations Conference cannot solve all the problems, but can establish new conceptions, new procedures, and maybe in 20 years we can come, this is a a compromise, we can come here to Harvard University or any other university, and the balance can be positive balance. And I would say to Mr. Strong that I think we must have access to what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on in the negotiations, and how can we have a more influential role in these negotiations. I recognized that when we have some discussions with some UN representatives, they always say, okay, NGOs have a very, very important role in this conference. But is it true? What's happening? Will you play a very important role or not? Or we are suffering a cooptation process? It's very difficult to say. Anyway, I think we must organize ourselves. We must design a strategic plan. We must establish some alliances between NGOs in the United States, NGOs in Brazil, NGOs in Africa, and to try to see what we have to do. And I think we can, if it's not possible, to change the tendency to transform the United Nations Conference in Brazil in the environmental circles. We have the compromise to denounce it to the public opinion.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Claudine Schneider. Claudine Schneider was a 5-term congresswoman representing Rhode Island and has distinguished herself as an energetic and effective environmental leader. While in Congress, she served for 10 years on the Science, Research, and Technology Committee and led the effort to kill the Clinch River breeder reactor. She also introduced a waste end tax and undertook research on indoor air pollution and radon. Her bill on global warming prevention has been the primary strategy plan for the global warming strategy. Claudine Schneider is currently an IOP fellow. She is a chairman of the board of an organization called Renew America, which is the first national environmental clearinghouse, and is also running for U.S. Senate. And let me end with a quote as one scientist. That's a statement. As one scientist studying in the Amazon said of Representative Schneider, and I quote, "When it comes to biological diversity and international conservation, Claudine Schneider knows from when she speaks. She has penetrated the Amazon more deeply than any other member of the U.S. government since Teddy Roosevelt." Claudine Schneider.
Look at Teddy. Well, thank you very much, Shanta, and it is a pleasure to have the opportunity to join with all of you today, and particularly to be flanked by two stellar leaders in the environmental community. What I'd like to share today with you in reference to the new environmental order is to put it a little bit into perspective, because 20 years ago, the U.S. responded vigorously. Now, I want to emphasize my choice of words. The U.S., meaning the U.S. government, responded vigorously. That means that the government reacted to what the grassroots said. And it is critically important to understand, having been a member of Congress for the last 10 years, you have 535 people in Washington, and very few of them are leaders. They follow their constituency. They follow the grassroots. So I, like Fabio Feldman, are throwing the challenge out to all of you to understand that if you want leadership, you must provide it yourself. And then you will have collective action toward addressing the problems. Well, 20 years ago, We looked at the challenges that we had at that time, and we came up with new policies. We developed in the 1970s the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, RCRA, a whole broad spectrum of pieces of legislation to address various environmental problems. At the same time, we came up with new institutions. We developed the Environmental Protection Agency. We developed the Council on Environmental Quality, a whole broad spectrum of institutions to address the problems. However, today, 20 years later, we have many more serious and more challenging experiences in the environment than we did in the 70s. We must tackle the challenge of global warming. We must tackle the challenge of ozone depletion, of air pollution, of wetlands disappearance, not to mention the fact groundwater pollution, indoor air pollution, a whole broad spectrum of challenges. But also, we must look at the developing world. As a result of the communications and our world becoming much smaller through technology over the last 20 years, we know more and we can share that knowledge with other nations. But the developing world now is putting pressures on natural resources, and those pressures are intensifying daily. Hundreds of millions of people are destroying the resources on which their future depends because there is no apparent alternative that is open to them. Those were not the concerns of the United States 20 years ago, but they are the concerns of the United States today. We have policy challenges that are much more global in their scope and international in their implications. And my thought is that if the United Nations conference in 1992 in Brazil, if our national and international efforts there should happen to fall short, I think that we can anticipate irreparable damage. But I am both optimistic and pessimistic because I believe that even though we may hear words or we may have a few documents signed, I think that the real value that we can excerpt from the conference would be the value of exchanging ideas, exchanging names, exchanging models, and making things happen through that cross-pollination of information. As we look at the problems that we need to face, I think that we have new precepts on which we can base our decision-making policies. There is no question but that both we and the developing world need to rely more on market mechanisms. Also, we must put as a top priority speedy transfer of technology that promotes sustainable development. We must also change our way of thinking, as is already happening to a great degree in the United States, but we have to speed up this way of thinking, and that is pollution prevention. I mean, fortunately, when I came here to the ARCO forum and to the dining room, I see that we have recycling bins, and I am relieved because you have to walk your talk. If you say that it's a good idea to recycle, then we have to put our money where our mouth is, and that is to participate and provide leadership. Also, we have to keep in mind that tropical deforestation can be arrested. Species can be saved. Human populations can even be stabilized, and climate change can be contained. And for those of you who are interested, I brought copies of my legislation, which was introduced a couple of years ago, and different colleagues of mine have taken pieces of it, so it is still moving ahead. But if you'd like to see the specific steps on how we can attack global warming problems, I'll be happy to share that information with you. Let me say that there is no question in my mind that we need to tackle these international global challenges with a strategy. We need to do it rapidly, and we need to multiply our successful programs. I might mention that as a result of the forum of the little conference that we had a few moments ago, there was question about how do we get the word out. Professor Clark had suggested that when we have good models, let's spread the word. Renew America is the only organization in the United States that is a clearinghouse of information on environmental success stories that have been developed either by individuals, institutions, state and local government, and we do have that information and we need to share it rapidly. Let me just say that the environment is connected to everything. The environment, as we know, is connected to our human health. The environment is connected to our economy. whether we're talking about improving our economic development and the demands on energy, that is an environmental question. Whether we're talking about environmental cost accounting, that will impact our GNP. And certainly eco-security, our national security interests are environmentally oriented, and I'll be happy to elaborate more on that later if you're interested. But the bottom line is that everything is connected to the environment, and we are all in this together. Those are not original thoughts I'm sharing with you now, but if you remember nothing else of what I said, I hope you will remember those two thoughts. And to drive those home, I'd like to share with you those same thoughts that were much more better articulated at least 100 years ago by an Indian chief. This we know: the earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. This we know. All things are connected, like the blood which unites one family. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons of the earth. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. So whether you go to Brazil personally in 1992 to attempt to solve some problems, or whether you stay here in Cambridge, the bottom line is that you, for the 1990s and beyond, are either part of the problem or part of the solution. And I sincerely hope that everyone in this room chooses to be part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker hardly needs an introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Maurice Strong is a Canadian. He was, as many of you probably know, secretary to the Stockholm Conference in 1972, and in many ways represents the continuity in the whole field of environment and development. Since then, he has been involved in the Brundtland Commission. He has been very active with UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, for the last 20 years. He's on the he's a member of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and most recently has been appointed Secretary General of the UN Conference on Environment and Development in 1992. So, Maurice Strong.
Well, thank you very much. I do appreciate this opportunity of appearing on the same table here with two very distinguished environmental colleagues who've been in this battle for many years in their own particular way, and I've had great admiration over many years for Claudine, who's really been on the right side of these issues, giving leadership in Congress and out of it, and hopefully in the Senate again. I'm not supposed to take a position on these issues, but I can express a personal hope.
Thank you.
Certainly I have only met Mr. Congressman Feldman today, but I've heard of him for a long time, and if I had no other pleasure at coming here, it would have been worth it just to come and finally meet you. And I've been crossing his footsteps for ages, and I'm very pleased to be at the same table with him. I don't think I have to say an awful lot. I'm really a practitioner, an operator. And I would probably prefer to respond to your questions and concerns. I'm asked, though, to give a few minutes of just a little bit of an update of where we are. Very quickly, you know that the purpose of the 1972 conference in Stockholm was to put the environmental issue on the world agenda, which it did. I agree with Mr. Feldman that since then, we haven't made the progress that Stockholm envisaged. A lot of good things have happened, but on the whole, the condition of our planet, as the Brundtland Commission pointed out in its report in 1987, has deteriorated. And that is one of the reasons why the General Assembly of the United Nations, largely in response to the evidence produced by the Brundtland Commission, decided in 1989 to hold a conference and accepted the invitation of Brazil to hold it in Brazil, and Brazil subsequently decided it would be in Rio in June 1992, not just to commemorate the Stockholm Conference, but to recognize that the issues which brought us together in Stockholm had become more acute, more imminent. We had a lot more information on them, and there was a compelling need for action. That's why it was decided to make it a conference on environment and development, recognizing the reality that it is through our economic life and our economic behavior primarily that we affect the environment positively or negatively. It's only through major and fundamental changes in our economic life, the level of individuals, at the level of corporations, at the level of nations, and relationships between North and South, that we will address these problems. Environmental regulation is necessary but not enough. It must be accompanied by fundamental changes in our economic life. And this means addressing the underlying system which motivates our economic life, the systems of incentives and penalties, fiscal measures, tax measures, economic instruments of various kinds, which provide the motivational undergirding for our economic life. We have to re-examine these, and we have to revamp them to ensure that they provide positive incentives to a transition to sustainability, positive incentives to the kind of economic growth that will be consistent with the maintenance of environmental integrity and values. Indeed, as the Brundtland Commission, I think, pointed out very well, it's the only kind of growth that makes sense in economic terms as well as environmental terms. I believe that what we really are doing in Brazil in 1992 is laying the framework for a fundamental transition in industrial civilization, an eco-industrial revolution, I've called it. But it really is going, and I think it's going to be a very positive thing. And I don't think it's something that runs counter to the interests of people or nations. I think we have a lot of evidence to support the fact that environmental improvement is fully consistent with economic growth, not with the kind of economic growth that has been destroying this planet, but with the kind of economic growth we must have. We cannot now, we in the North who have enjoyed the fruits and the benefits of the longest and most important period of economic growth in the world's history. We've enjoyed the accumulated benefits of that, and of course we are now realizing the negatives that this has created. But those negatives have been created for the rest of the world too, for the developing world. And now to assume that we can impose constraints on their development simply because we now recognize that we have created a whole new generation of global risks which they share with us. This is going to be the fundamental issue at the 1992 conference. Are we prepared to modify the system? Are we prepared to live up to our market system commitment? Most of the nations in the North and many in the South today have a basic commitment to the operation of the market system. And that can be made an ally in this transition. It must be made an ally. But in so many of the countries now which espouse the market system, they allow internally, they have policies of subsidies and incentives that have grown up over the years, which cost literally billions of dollars, that are destructive to the environment and costly to the economy. And we have to understand that, and we have to change that. Now, finally, just in what do we expect out of the 1992 conference? There's a vast array of specific issues, ranging from desertification, from obviously the conventions on ozone and on climate change and biodiversity, and probably on global forestry. But we're putting these within the framework of 6 basic agenda areas. The first is what I call a charter, an Earth Charter. We've got to start with first principles. Now, of course, some of them have already been incorporated in such instruments as the Stockholm Declaration. But I would like to see and hope governments will agree to a basic set of principles setting out the fundamental basis for the relationships between people and nations with each other and with the Earth, to ensure the future sustainability of life of the Earth as a hospitable home for life on for people and for other forms of life. Secondly, an agenda for the 21st century. starting with 1993, leading up to 2000. A very explicit agenda incorporating a whole series of the individual measures that are needed to deal with these issues, indicating the targets, the institution that will have to be given responsibility, the processes through which that responsibility will be shared among several institutions, the costs, and how those costs will be borne, and finally a means of dealing with them through the means of giving effect to the. I should mention that this agenda will not be just a sterile action plan that many conferences produced. It will be a dynamic instrument with provision for monitoring, for feedback, for review, and for revision. Then three major items which really address themselves to the means by which the agenda can be carried out. One, the question of new and additional financial resources, recognizing that the developing countries have a basic need for assistance. They have a basic claim on assistance because they are going to be asked to join with us in measures that are going to secure our common future on this planet. And it's in our interests, for all the traditional development, moral and development reasons, yes, but also for a new set of environmental reasons, to ensure that they have access to the new and additional resources they require. That's not going to be easy. It's going to be a very, very tough issue given the current economic realities. The case is going to have to be made cogently, persuasively, and very, very in very good, hard analytical terms. Then technology transfer. It's in everybody's interest that the developing countries have access to the environmentally sound technologies they need to incorporate in their development and make the transition to sustainability. And institutional change. What kind of changes do we need in institutional structures and processes? Not just the creation of vast new central bureaucracies, but systems that link organizations from the grassroots to the very senior policy levels. One of the most important institutional changes we need are changes in institutional process, which enable people, non-governmental organizations, scientists, educators, religious, spiritual, cultural leaders, all those who have insights and experience and capacity and represent important components of society's structure, to feed them into our process. We are trying to, you raised the question, Mr. Feldman, what are we doing? NGOs are not just going to be present outside in a parallel conference in Rio. Of course that'll occur, but they have to be, and we've invited them to be present all the way through the process. We are going to rely not only on governments, but don't exclude governments. Governments have to take some pretty basic commitments in Rio. But we are involving them in our working parties, and they're sitting around with the agency representatives, with the UN representatives, with other intergovernmental and governmental experts in our secretariat work process. And the preparatory committee has agreed on a formula to enable them to have their say at the level of the preparatory committee, which is the intergovernmental preparatory or mechanism. So we need their inputs. And, frankly, the non-governmental community is going to have to bear much of the responsibility for implementing the results of that conference. So it's not just a question of coming to the conference. It's a question of being an integral part of the process of preparing the proposals that will be put in front of the leaders of the governments of the world when they meet in Rio. Finally, I should remark that the General Assembly took a decision last December, that the representation of governments at the conference will be at the level of head of state or head of government, which will make it the largest summit conference ever, the first time we've ever had a formally mandated summit-level conference, and we're calling it the Earth Summit. And I think that's very appropriate because the leaders of the Earth will be gathered in Rio literally to decide the future of the Earth. And finally, the question of conventions. This conference will not be a place where conventions will be negotiated. The conventions will be negotiated on separate tracks prior to the conference and will be signed or agreed at whatever stage they have reached at the conference itself. So the conventions are important, but they are not the central product of the conference. The conference is giving tremendous impetus to the process of reaching agreement on those conventions because it's extremely important that we do that. But The other outputs of the conference, in my view, must add up to the basis for a fundamental transition in our economic behavior and in relations between North and South, between privileged and underprivileged within societies. I think we have a new basis for that. I think we have some real hope that we can do that, but it's going to be very tough to do. You said at the end of your remarks, Mr. Feldman, that if we don't do what you think we should done, we'll be denounced. Well, that's fine. Easy to denounce. But we hope you'll be in there, I know you are, also helping to make it work. The one thing that's important about this conference, it must not be a quiet failure. It either must succeed or it must fail dramatically. And I hope the latter it will not happen, and I hope you'll all join us in making sure that our emphasis is on success. Success is imperative. People say, is it really feasible to make those changes? My answer is it has to be feasible because it's our only chance. It sounds a little pretentious to say it's our last chance. Nobody knows that for sure. But you tell me, if that conference breaks down in 1992, when do you think would be the next time that the leaders of the world would agree to come together to discuss these issues? Likely not in our generation. And perhaps not, perhaps anything beyond that wouldn't be worth the effort. So I really do believe that we've all got a fundamental stake in 92, and this meeting encourages me to believe that we've got lots of allies who are committed as I am to trying to make it work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have some time for questions. I just want to mention a few of the ground rules. First of all, if you want to ask a question, please come down to one of these two microphones on the ground floor. I believe there aren't any on the second floor. The other is to please, first of all, to ask a question. Secondly, to keep your question short. And thirdly, to say which of the panelists you're addressing your question to. So let me start with Rocky.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Strong. You said that there is a need of fundamental changes in the economic life, and that is part of what is expected, at least to begin, at the Rio conference. Could you give us your feeling of how large countries and important countries like the US, like China, Russia, and Brazil are reacting to a change in the economical attitude?
Well, I won't give you a long answer to that, but it would take a long answer to answer it fairly. Quickly, Japan. Japan has effected greater reductions in air and water pollution than any other major country. It has done that by a combination of some of the most severe pollution control regulations and some of the most generous incentives to industry. In the course of it, it has created and it has dramatically lowered pollution levels. It's not I don't say that they've reached a state of environmental sainthood or anything like that, but they have done a dramatically decent job domestically, and they have created a new generation of comparative advantage for their industry in the meantime, and they've done this while enjoying the highest levels of economic growth of any country. Some very real lessons in that. China, I was at a meeting in China recently, a national Chinese meeting, at which they were considering in great depth at the ministerial level and even at the level of the Prime Minister the need to incorporate environment into their economy. And it's a very big and complex country, but just one little fact. For example, 75% of energy use in China is from coal. They're very aware of that. Coal is the major source of energy they have. And they want to and need to double their economic growth. They can do so without increasing their net contributions to greenhouse gas emissions by some measures with existing technologies. For example, converting 750,000 industrial boilers. That can be done with a known amount, with existing technology, with a known amount of money. It would be a tremendously good investment for the whole international community. But if we want to really be cost effective, we should be considering that kind of assistance to China. United States, you all know America better than I do. America always eventually comes through. I have great faith in America. Sometimes they're in the lead and sometimes they aren't at a given moment in time. But overall, the very fact that a group of largely Americans like this would gather here to consider this issue gives me hope that America is going to come through too. And after all, let's not forget, America has been the lead in so many areas in these issues. You might think it's lagging here and there in some of the issues at this moment, but on the whole, America, I believe, will come through. And indeed, that's going to be the key. What you people think and what your politicians believe you think is going to be really very critical to the success of the conference. So I just hope, Claudine, you just hang in there. Absolutely. And I know that if you're in there, the right things will get done.
Okay. Camilla?
Yeah, in the light of what Mr. Strong said about involvement, I wonder if he could tell us perhaps how students at Harvard can get involved here and now in the conference and maybe at the conference itself.
Sorry, I'd be happy to have some other people answer that question, but in essence, this helps me. I don't learn much when I'm talking, but when I'm listening, I do learn something. And I think that they're in each. If you take the time and trouble to examine our agenda, it's complex. The processes, the issues are very difficult. They're not. You can't answer them simply. We have a working party set up for every single issue, and we have some of the world's leading experts in each of those working parties, and we actually can invite you all to those. But we are prepared to consider seriously any basic submissions that you want to make to us at the Secretariat. See, the Secretariat doesn't control anything. We feed in to the governments. But at our level, we're very happy to have these inputs. And if you have you're prepared to take the time and trouble to prepare some substantive inputs, we'll make sure they get in there. And at the preparatory committee level, working through non-governmental organizations, there's a very well-defined procedure for doing that. You can come to the preparatory committee through an authorized non-governmental organization, and it's not that difficult to become an authorized non-governmental organization.
Since the person who asked the question is clearly one who has chosen to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, let me suggest if there are others who fit into that category who want to be part of the solution, I welcome you to come and visit me while I'm here. My office is right down the hall there, and I can plug you into different organizations or individuals or events that are happening. But let me suggest two things that I'm really struggling with, and it seems to me there ought to be an answer here, if not in this audience, somewhere at Harvard. I happen to believe that the two greatest challenges we face to solving environmental problems is information transfer and technology transfer. To give you an example, I was overwhelmed walking at the United Nations Decade on Women's Conference in '85, approached by two African women who had several children hanging on them, and they walked up to me and they said, "Excuse me, are you an American?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "Can you tell me how not to have children?" That is information transfer. These women sorely wanted that information. And there has to be some system that we can design. Now, I'm familiar with electronic bulletin boards, et cetera, but I think that if there is someone at Harvard that has some knowledge about how to, number one, communicate and is interested in information transfer, please see me, because I have a lot of problems that I'd like to figure out how we can solve those. And secondly, in terms of information technology transfer, because there is money there. There is capital available. Finances are not always the problem. Sometimes it's just connecting point A to point B. This man here came to my office some time ago when I was in Congress, and he said, "Look, we're stopping the nuclear power plant in Brazil, but we want to offer a better idea. What is the latest technological information you have for energy?" And I had to go scramble around and find the information for them. There's not one place where we can turn, but there ought to be a system where we can have some of that information available, and I think that would be an enormous help, particularly to developing countries as well as our own.
Thank you. Yeah, over there.
I like to catch where Maurice Strong quit his speech with either disaster or success. There has been other conferences, like, for instance, the regional conference, ECE conference, which was in Bergen this year, which was the first follow-up to the UN Commission and our Common Future report. There was some significant problems on that conference, which was meant to be followed up in 1992. And I specifically like to ask 3 questions, one to Feldman, one to Schneider, and one to Strong with respect to this issue. First, to Schneider. As a representative for the American government, I guess it would be nice for you to know that after the Bergen conference, when NGOs representing more than 130 million organized people classified the different countries in way of being environmental, progressive or not, they made a blacklist, a list of the 3 worst countries. Number 1, United States. Number 2, United Kingdom. Number 3, Soviet Union. My question is, of course, does US expect itself to have the same position in Brazil 1992, and how do you want to achieve another position? On Feldman.
Maybe I should answer
Very
this
short
one first.
question. Can I just?
Oh, okay.
There might be connected. You might cooperate all 3 on asking, on answering. To Feldman, it was a big issue in Bergen, which is probably going to be a big issue in Brazil, and that is debt for nature swaps, or debt for sustainable development. What is your position on specifically exchanging debt for sustainable development, or specifically for nature swaps? And to Maurice Strong, a comment. You refer to Japan as a good example. If you split Japan as you can split the United States into 3 categories, when you look at specifically pollution areas, primary, secondary and tertiary production, you will find that Japan's primary production is outside Japan, and that's the most dirty production in the whole world. Thank you.
Will the United States be at the top of the dirty dozen list, perhaps? There is a good chance that we will still be at the top of that list. Part of the reason that I can guess that, or perhaps assume that, is because what we are looking at is not only a change in our perceptions of the problem, but to some degree a lifestyle change. And when we are compared to other nations around the world, we are the most wasteful of all of our resources, whether it be fossil fuels, whether it be forest, whatever it may be. But more often than not, if that is the criteria by which you are measuring who are the bad guys, yes, I guess the United States may fit into that category as number 1, as you say. Also because we have, we're only 5% of the population of the world, but use about, at least in so far as oil is concerned and energy resources, we use about 50% of it. So yes, we are an enormous consuming nation. For us to change, since the last report, what was that, last year, did you say? Till 92, I don't see it happening. But let me suggest something, that change has to happen by all of us as a nation. And if our nations are going to be compared as the dirty dozen and we make the top of the list, there are environmental groups that rate members of Congress and delineate who are the dirty dozen. And I'm sure some of them are your representatives in the U.S. Congress. So you might refer to the environmental action and also to the League of Conservation Voters, because if you want change, it has to take place in government, but also for we as a nation, every one of us have to change our ways in order for us to change our ranking on the international charts.
Okay. Regarding that swap, we are trying to have that swap in Brazil for many years, but there is 3 years ago we have some troubles with some military people, very conservative people, because they understood that for nature in the Amazon region as an attempt against our sovereignty, because in their minds we could change our debt with the biodiversity of Amazonian region, for example. Then it was impossible. This government will have different problems. They think that swap can have a very important impact on the inflation rates in Brazil. Anyway, I think I would like to make some comments about this. What happened to Brazil, since we have a very well-known environmentalist, José Lutzenberger, as the head of the Environmental State Secretary, we have a terrible change in some relations with the NGOs and many governments. Then, what happened? That we have a decrease of the pressure on the Brazilian government. And I'm making this comment in order to add some comments to Mr. Maurice Strong speech. I think it's very, very important to establish some principles. And the Brundtland Commission was really very, very important, I think, because until we have the Brundtland Commission, it was very difficult to talk about some issues because we have no credibility as no governmental organizations or as activists. I disagree with the United Nations as a whole, but I have to consider that the United Nations has a institutional charisma. And since we have the Brundtland report, many theses, many facts were proved because it was written in a United Nations publication. It was very, very important for us to discuss some issues in Brazil and other underdeveloped countries. But the problem with our common future is we have to ask about our common present. Okay, 9/2, we have 9/2 conference in a year and a half. What I would ask to Mr. Strong, what they think, what are the tendencies in some changes concerning World Bank criteria to give financial support. We have a merge of UNDP and UNEP. What I want to know, and it's important to know to act as no governmental organizations, what role we must play in order to have concrete advances. Why? Because I think the governments are very, very important. For this reason, I ran to be a congressman. It's important. We have acted in all spaces, political spaces. I consider myself, and I was talking with Karen, that is one of the organizers, why don't you go to work in the World Bank? But she asked me, why World Bank? Go there to make espionage. It's important for translation is very difficult. I try to translate a Portuguese word to espionage for echo, or echo guerrilla or something like that, as we do in the Congress, because I am the only green congressman in all Brazilian Congress. Anyway, it's important to get there, to fight in American Congress. But what I would like to know is what we can have in this conference, Mr. Strong. I know that we have to change the values of our society. Everybody knows here. But it's very difficult to change values. And it's very difficult to convince Americans that you can pay more tax in order to reduce the CO2 emissions. We face these problems, these concrete dilemmas in the next 5-10 years. But what are our chances? What kind of institutional changes we will face in the United Nations in the real conference? Because I can give you the example of Brazilian government. There is no changes. We have the most well-known environmentalist as a head of the State Environment Secretary. But what is the result after 10 months, almost a year? All the public opinion has changed their minds, but we have the same public policies in Brazil, in the Amazonian region, and in all regions. I am afraid that we have the same procedure, the same process. We have all media there, all public opinion there. Then I think we have no changes. In other words, can we work together in order to know what we have to do, what we have to get, what we can reach? How can we help you and other people who won't have real changes? This is my question. If it's not possible to have this progress, okay, tell us. Then we know what we have to do. But we must know what is going on in order to have the institutional changes and to create the procedures to recognize, for example, the NGOs as important social actors in a new United Nations or new international agencies. This is the most important, to have concrete points that we can fight, if it's possible, fight together, Mr. Strong.
Well, on the comment on Japan, first of all, I think it's a correct comment, and that's why I said that Japan had done some very good things at the domestic level. Of course, they've imposed some very important environmental costs on others. That's true, because it isn't the whole story. As I mentioned, it is simple, but it does demonstrate that you can do a great deal within the context of a growing economy. But it isn't, as you point out, the whole story. On your very large question, I won't attempt to answer it totally. I tried to in my first remarks. The issues are difficult. There's a real chance that we won't do it. I don't have to do this job. I mean, I could say, oh, well, the hell with it. It's not much, there isn't much chance. You could make a strong intellectual case. The evidence is very, very pessimistic in some cases. But I am convinced it is possible to change, and I think it's imperative to change. And I believe that if we can get out to the people of the world, that's one of the reasons I'm playing, I had to concentrate my first few months in this job on the professional work. Because if you're going to have serious proposals that are going to be accepted by governments, they have to be well-grounded in good professional work, because they can be politically discredited if they're not professionally sound. So we get the world's scientific community, including the non-governmental scientists, all kinds of them, working on this. Now we're moving into a phase where we want to get the message out to the people that the Earth Summit in 1992 is of critical importance to them and to their church and to their children and to their own futures. Now, that is the key. In my view, if the people that the leaders represent aren't interested in 92, are not much interested in what happens there, are not going to be holding their leaders responsible for what they do or fail to do, then there will be a strong likelihood of failure. But I do think there's also a very good possibility of success. We need to create in the next year, and I've got Ted Turner the other day agreed to turn on his CNN network away from the war now on to 92. Time Life has taken a real interest in this. So we're busy trying to get some of the media people, the NGOs, working with us to get this message out to people. So they then will send their leaders to Rio with a message that they care about what decisions are taken. They're going to hold their leaders accountable for those decisions so that the leaders of the world do have every possible incentive to make the right decisions. Even having said that, I agree there's a very real risk of failure. But is that a reason to give up? It's surely a reason to redouble our efforts.
With regard to the question of redoubling efforts and the risk of a quiet failure versus success, I'm sure everyone who's here wants the UN process to be a success. But I have a personal concern that it will instead be the quiet failure you described, and that's because I have a very strong impression that the two most important issues that need to be addressed have been left out. The first is population, which Claudine Schneider's example was a demonstration of, and secondly, the fact that the kinds of resources that we have available to us and that we're putting into sustainable development and environment issues are absolutely swamped by militaristic spending and arms. And I'd like each of the panelists, the host, probably the most important economic country in the process, and the organizer to comment on what we, if my impression is correct, and secondly, what we do about that. Excuse me.
Population is a very complex issue. Why? Because population is, I think we must control population. But if you compare the consumption of natural resources of American or 100 Brazilians, poor Brazilians or Africans, you'll see that this is maybe is not the most important issue. Okay, we can control population. And what you, United States, Europe and other countries will do in order to reduce the waste in the use of natural resources, we can put in this way. I think I'm not a member of the Brazilian government. I am the opposition, not because not because I think it's important for environmentalists to be in the opposition, because it's very difficult to work with this government when they know how to use the media, and you know how important was Luxembourg in order to change the public opinion without real changes in Brazil. Okay, I think Brazil could be the leader of some countries in order to discuss some points like this one. Okay, we control population, but okay, you must do your part. Second, it's the same what happened in Brazil in the last 2 or 3 years. We are burning our forests and we have a terrible pressure against us, and I think it was really important to stop the burnings. But anyway, we stopped the burnings, but what the Americans and the other countries did? Nothing. Then I think what's important when we design a strategic plan is to make some linkage in order to see if it's possible to have some compromises. Okay, poor countries can control population if you can have some changes in international relations. Why? Because you can see in Brazil and any other countries, when you give more education to people, they used to have less children.
I'd just like to make a quick comment, even though you didn't ask for my input. I can't help it.
I said the largest economic
all right, I just
in the United States.
Very quickly, because there are many people that want to ask questions, I'd just like to add that another example that I think will transfer the thought that I wish to convey. Also in Africa, in Kenya to be exact, I met a cab driver, and we started talking, and he very quickly told me that he had 2 children. Well, I knew that that was unusual because the average family has 8 children, and that Kenya has one of the largest population growth rates in the world, 3.2, I believe it is. Well, he proceeded to tell me, I said, how many wives do you have? He said, only 1 wife, which was also unusual. He had 1 wife and 2 children, and I said, why are you going to have more? And he said, no, I'm only going to have 2. And I said, why is that? He said, I am a cab driver, and I want to make more money, but I cannot read or write. And I know that in order to send my children to school so they don't have to be cab drivers, they must be able to read and write. And I have to be able to afford to be able to do that. Once again, I think this is a challenge of information transfer. There are many people throughout the world who would not choose to have 8 children if they knew how not to. And I think it is our moral obligation to share with them that technology and that information. Now, whether our government will decide to do that or not, we haven't in the past. I feel that that is inappropriate, But if the government doesn't do it, then we have to rely on the NGOs to do it. But that information must be shared with them. I share Fabio's point that we cannot tell people they have to reduce their birth rate. Who are we to tell other nations what to do with their families any more than who is the government to tell women what to do with their bodies? But the fact of the matter is, a few pro-choice folks in the audience here, the fact of the matter is that we are in a situation where, yes, we are using more resources, as Fabio points out, but our mindset has changed. This is no longer the 60s or the 70s where we say, thou shalt not pollute, thou shalt not dump in the ocean, thou shalt not pollute the air. Instead, our way of getting action now is to provide information and technology and to provide economic incentives also to say, here's how you can change things. Here is how you can provide for your family and improve your own family budget. So once again, I get back to the fact that it's our moral obligation to share with them that information on population.
I can probably relieve you of your concern that population isn't in there. It is. Population, like energy, is not named in the sectoral subject matters because, like agriculture, because they're listed by sectors. But I have a senior member of my staff that does nothing but ensure that population dimension is in every single item. The questionnaire we sent out to national governments for the national reports specifically asks them to examine for them the implications of their population growth in relation to their available resources and their expected levels of economic life. So it's there, and in fact the UN is even having a separate population conference after our conference to highlight those issues.
That's fine.
No. Our problem is integrating population with all the other elements. This is a systemic process of which the population dimension is. Finally, on security, it's an important point that shouldn't be bypassed. Let me only say there that we have got to change our mindset on security to understand that the environmental risks we face now in the period, in the next century and even now, are going to be far more acute in terms of their pervasive risks to our security. And the minute we start thinking that way about them, the question won't be a can we afford or can we not. Like conventional security, we will simply make this an a priori commitment in terms of the use of our resources. And I think we'll find in doing so that our economy will benefit as much as our environment.
Okay, we have time for two more questions only.
Thank you. Just want to say that I am very moved by Mr. Feldman's predicament, but I sympathize with Maurice Strong's perennial acceptance of the challenge to move the bureaucracies international and national. I accepted a similar challenge when a congressional action, I believe Representative Schneider was part of it, creating a Christopher Columbus Quincentenary Commission. And I accepted an appointment by the Reagan administration to a commission no one has heard of. Now, I'm fascinated by 1992 in this building has been discussed either through the European Common Market or now the Environment Conference or the upcoming elections. Now, 1992 also has a very special symbolic importance for the New World, and the three panels are from the New World. You've just heard...
Could you ask the question, please?
Yes, I'm coming to that. You've just heard the reference to the Bergen Conference, and I wonder if the symbolism of what we like to call the encounter of the two worlds, what the Spaniards call the discovery, would not be a good theme for a previous regional conference, because otherwise I think it's no exaggeration to suggest that you will see, with the present state of relations between the United States and Latin America, that your conference too will be a battlefield concerning unequal development and so forth. If it would not be a good opportunity to reassess our respective histories and relations in a New World regional conference prior to the Rio meeting. Thank you.
Well, very quickly, I'm going to Mexico City on Monday for such a conference. It isn't solely on the effects of the 500 years of European immigration, but that's one of the issues. Also, we are actively, as a secretariat, supporting the indigenous people in their attempts to put together in Brazil a conference. It's very hard for them to get together because they don't have the same organizational structures. So we're giving special attention, and I hope that Congressman Feldman, with his long commitment to the indigenous people of his area, will take our active interest in this, because I think if the indigenous people of the world, not just of the Americas, have important messages for us, and they should be heard at the conference, and we should help them get together to get their own messages together for the conference.
Thank you. Last question.
I'd like to address this specifically to Congressman Feldman, but then maybe the other panelists would like to comment. It seems that the most likely force to derail this conference is national sovereignty. We've seen in the Persian Gulf, we've seen in questions of acid rain floating into Canada, the investigations that Congressman Feldman mentioned of congressmen going down to the Amazon region. I can't imagine what the American public is going to respond with when we are requested to put on a carbon tax or something like that. Mr. Strong, you commented that it's up to political constituencies that favor these reforms to push for them and to hold our leaders accountable. But when it comes to things like carbon taxes and other things that would challenge accepted conventions, political conventions, it seems that there's going to be a special demand for leadership from the conference. I would like you to comment on the possibilities for overcoming this obstacle and what's being done in the preparatory stages.
Well, as international secretariats, we have possibilities and limitations. We serve governments, and we therefore have got to look to governments as for our prime mandates. But fortunately, the governments are very open-minded, and our preparatory committee has urged me to do everything I can to ensure that we get our conference messages out to the media and to the NGO community. So I feel I have a mandate from my governing body to do this, and we are doing. I'm giving a tremendous amount of personal attention to this. I've got a network of advisors around the world, political leaders who are willing to commit themselves to helping to move their governments and helping to ensure that the message gets out to the people in their areas. So we are. You're going there, and I can't tell you today, but we are working on some measures. One which I hope will result in every human being on this planet being involved. Whether it'll succeed or not, we just can't tell you very much more about it, but you'll hear about it. It may fail dismally, but we're going to try to get through to every human being on this planet to make sure that when their leaders go, they know that their people are deeply concerned and interested in what they do in Rio.
I don't care to add anything, but you may want to take another question instead.
Do you want to add something to that?
About sovereignty. I think sovereignty must be a very important issue, because when we were discussing today, the representative of World Bank was talking about has given an example about the energetic plan of Brazil. It proves that there is no more sovereignty for underdeveloped countries when you have terrible external debt and you need money and you need come here and come to some creditors, some banks, and you have to ask for money. We can say that sovereignty is not absolute conception as was designed some time ago. But anyway, I think we must design new conceptions of sovereignty in order to see how the conception can be applied not only in Brazil but in other countries. And for example, I think this is a suggestion to Mr. Strong, for example, what is going on in the Brazilian Indians, a genocide. Okay, I think we must work in some new legal figure like genocide against Indians, against some minorities. And I think the 92 conference can be important because Untitled Conference, we must make the linkage between human rights, new conception of human rights and environment, and the cultural diversity. Anyway, I think we must change the conception of sovereignty, and what happened in this war is a good example, because Brazil has, to give an example, Brazil has no direct relation with what is going on in the Gulf, but we can suffer the results of the oil split that happened there.
Thank you. Actually, I think we might have time for one quick last question.
Thank you very much. This is a combination of a question and comment, and it's directed really at the panel, probably more particularly to Mr. Strong. When I began the study of law, one of the very basic principles I learned in equity was that he who comes to equity must come with clean hands. Over the course of this conference today, one thing has stood really strong among all the panelists is that we are all agreed that the problem of the environment is inextricably linked with every other aspect of human endeavor. In 1974, I guess, the Charter of Economic Rights and of Economic and Social Rights and Duties of States, the precursor to the movement towards a new international economic order, was, I think,
could you get to the question? We really need to move on.
Yeah, I'm getting there, sir. Was I think, proposed and published by the General Assembly of the UN, United Nations. At that time, the developed countries of this world downplayed the call for a new international economic order by the developing world, because I think they did think that the issues involved only concern the developing world. Today we do recognize that issues of environment really do cover issues of economics and social and other concerns. Why don't we then address the issue of a new international economic order, or rather a new world order, rather than talking about just the environment? That's the issue I'm raising here. Why do we skirt the real questions?
Can you answer that in 3 minutes?
Well, just one. President Bush has just unveiled a concept of New World Order, which, and we've been talking about new environmental order. I hope that within the context of the New World Order that the President has articulated, and I think all of us are very anxious to hear what he has in mind, but we really deeply hope that he will include a new environmental order within that world order, because a new environmental order cannot come about independent of everything else.
I would just add that there is a sampling of things to come in what is called Enterprise for the Americas. And this particular program moved through Congress and the Senate last year. There are still some pieces that have not passed, but in essence it is focused on, at this time, just Central and South America. Its goal is to reduce the debt of Central and South America, and by reducing that debt, part of the effort is to increase the market opportunities and free enterprise in those countries. One of the components of that legislation is also to provide for debt for nature swaps in those countries where they choose to do that. So we are achieving both environmental and economic ends. And as we say, this environmental initiative may be the means to that new economic world order. It is the means to the end. And rather than coming up with some new economic order where this one gets that or that, I mean, that's far too draconian, I would think, to try to design. But rather, let's go about solving problems. And if the end result is a stronger economy for both, which results in a win-win situation, then so much the better. We've done a good job.
Okay, thank you very much.